Hello and welcome to a new episode of Die KulturmittlerInnen, the IFA podcast on foreign cultural policy. My name is Amira El-Al and I'm delighted to have you with me again for this episode. For decades, the United States set the tone in global culture through Hollywood, higher education, technology, and diplomacy. But in 2025, Trump's second administration didn't just pull back. It launched a sweeping dismantling of America's soft power machinery. The impact is profound and widespread. On one hand, academic exchange programs like the esteemed Fulbright program, once called the crown jewel of American soft power, are facing staggering financial cuts, putting countless academic careers on hold overnight. On the other hand, the White House has begun withdrawing from multilateral initiatives like the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, the UNESCO, and the World Health Organization, the WHO. Walking away from decades of partnership in shaping global rules for education, culture, and public health. This marks not just a simple reorientation. It's a strategic turning point with ripple effects that reach classrooms, museums, and hospitals far beyond America's own borders. As Washington turns inward and embraces a more transactional worldview, its global cultural influence seems to fade. But what happens when the world's leading soft power steps back? Who might be looking to step in? And how can Europe seize the moment to redefine its global cultural role? With our guest today, Edward Knudsen, we explore the shifting landscape of global influence and the competition to fill America's soft power vacuum. He is a research fellow at the Center for International Security at the Hertie School, an affiliate policy fellow at the Jacques Delors Center, and is doing his PhD in international relations at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on historical political economy and comparative soft power. Recently, he published a report within the IFA research program in cooperation with the Hertie School called Domination Without Hegemony, the Emerging Contest to Fill the US Soft Power Vacuum. Welcome to Die Kulturmittlerin, Edward Knudsen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with the basics. How do you define soft power in today's geopolitical landscape?
So we conceptualize soft power as one of three different types of power that countries can have, the other two being military and economic power. And I think you can think of power in general as basically a way to get the outcomes you want, from international setting. That would be, from mostly other countries. Soft power, originally defined by Joseph Nye, he calls it the ability to get others to want what you want. So as opposed to, say, military power, where you either, invade a country or threaten to invade them or some kind of attack in order to get a political change. With soft power, you try to seek that change through things like persuasion, through kind of sharing your worldview, things of that nature. And of course, economic power, the third, it can be kind of sticks and carrots there, whether that's, trying to get access to a market or sanctions, something more coercive. But with soft power, you see a lot of different actors present in there. Some are more kind of deliberate policy instruments, the way a country might actually try to boost its profile, might try to attract more foreign researchers. But there's also a lot of historical factors, things that are a little bit harder to manipulate or alter in the short run. Things like culture, tradition, sort of perceived values of a given country. Those would all play into a country's soft power on the world stage.
So like the trust also that people kind of build up over decades and decades into something like that. But how have the policies of the second Trump administration accelerate the decline of U.S. soft power? I mean, just one example is the near total dismantling of USAID, with some 83% of programs officially cut, which affects people dramatically in dramatic ways all over the world. I mean, especially not in America, but all over the world. I mean, that's crazy, no?
Absolutely. No, yeah, absolutely. And I think before I answer that, there's a few things to say about U.S. soft power in particular that sets it apart from a lot of its kind of traditional allies, especially in the Euro-Atlantic space. And that's the relatively strong importance of the private sector to the U.S. So you have, all the best known universities in the U.S., right? Say the Ivy League, Stanford, et cetera. Those are all private institutions legally. Of course, they do get a lot of funding from the federal government. Things like Hollywood, that's obviously privately run and funded. Of course, there are connections with the government at various points in time. Things like, say, like the US's most prominent international broadcaster is CNN, which is a private corporation, not something like the BBC, Deutsche Welle, Al Jazeera, etc. And so there is this kind of level of distance between the state and the cultural sector. Of course, the U.S. has kind of used its power and used its influence to actually kind of manipulate some of these private sector establishments over time. Notably, during the Cold War, there was a lot of use of kind of cultural instruments funded by the CIA, for example. There's a great book on this by Francis Stoner Sanders. But overall, the things that maybe you would think of or the kind of average person globally would think of when they say, what's an American cultural export, right? They're going to think of something, kind of famously Harvard and Hollywood, right? And, those are private. So those are not directly part of the U.S. government. The U.S. does, of course, have a lot of instruments that do more closely parallel its, say, European counterparts. They just might not be as prominent. Those things like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, which recently closed down due to budget cuts, the Fulbright, and so on. Yeah. So there is a lot of, there are a number of programs. It's just that the U.S. is in a relatively special position, and it's basically the only country you could do this type of cultural vandalism to, or sort of attacks on soft power that wouldn't be completely catastrophic, right? Because there is still this very large and semi-independent private sector cultural apparatus that it can kind of fall back on. Of course, Trump has even made assaults on that, whether that's sort of trying to get his allies in actually private media institutions or kind of cutting funding for universities. So it's not like the U.S. state can't.
Yeah, or cutting funds for Voice of America, etc. I mean, it's literally trying to close that down.
Direct kind of thing, and it's easier for the U.S. state to attack a television channel that they directly fund. Trump's kind of taken it that next step and tried to actually exert some influence on the private sector as well. My point is just that it's a little bit more difficult to do that than it would, say, if there's a kind of far-right takeover in France or something. Like, so much more of the cultural sector is there directly attached or directly funded by the state. And so I think that's important to keep in mind and kind of complicates the picture here. But in terms of Trump's attacks on U.S. soft power, I would broadly divide those up into three different realms. One would be the actual attacks on these types of institutions, right? That's on Voice of America. USAID is not kind of a direct foreign cultural policy institution. However, there are some kind of cultural programs that go along with U.S. aid. But so the first would be the attacks on things like scholarships, on the kind of television channels that people might hear. The second would be attacks on funding and sort of diplomatic disruption more broadly. That's where I would put the U.S. aid cuts mostly. Say that, withdrawing from UNESCO, sort of even the tariffs have a negative soft power effect, right? You see this big kind of rally around the flag effect in Canada against the United States because they just sort of perceive this as internationally disruptive and combative. And the third, I think, would be slightly more kind of nebulous, but it's the kind of attack on traditional, you could say, American values, freedom, et cetera. And the U.S. has not always lived up to those values over time. Whether that's the Vietnam War, Iraq War, et cetera. But there is a kind of power to saying no, we're the country that supports liberal democracy. We support human rights. Again, not always living up to those ideals, but completely throwing those aside and saying we don't care about any of that. We think the Sustainable Development Goals are an attack on American sovereignty and condemning those. And this this sort of narrative assault on the normative foundations of American soft power is very important as well. So that would be the three being sort of specific targeted attacks on external cultural policy, 2 kind of diplomatic disruption, and 3 nebulous narrative.
And that's very interesting that you also divide them in these 3 categories, because it makes it more clear. You describe the U.S. approach in your report as dominance without cultural hegemony. Can you explain that a little bit? And what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. This is sort of adapting some of the ideas of cultural hegemony from the Italian Marxist scholar Antonio Gramsci. He talks a lot about hegemony in a kind of domestic sense, and we work to apply that to the international one. And he talks about how in a kind of domestic power relations, right? It's not enough for the ruling class to just have like the guns and the money, right? You need to get some kind of belief from people that the existing social structures and hierarchies have an actual logic to them. And, that's what he would call hegemony, right? And so this term, dominance without hegemony, comes from a book written about actually colonial India, where they talk about this, where, the sort of British ruling elites, they had this sort of like power, but they didn't have any buy-in, right? Or among most people. And so then that obviously contributes to independence over time. And international space, then what hegemony would mean is, not just that the U.S. has the world's largest economy, not just that it has the world's largest and most powerful military, but that people actually believe in the U.S. project and U.S. ideals. And so you can kind of think broadly, the era of not just dominance, but rather hegemony would be the Cold War and especially the post-Cold War era. Right, where the U.S. does have the kind of ability to dominate in a material sense, both economically and military, but they're also espousing values that appeal to people, right? People want to move to the U.S. I like the idea of freedom. It sounds kind of cheesy, but Ronald Reagan, the shining city on a hill, et cetera. You can kind of criticize how well that's worked in practice, but there is a real, and there has been a real draw of the United States. In addition to all of these cultural outputs, right? I mean, the amount of Europeans who, when they were teenagers, will say, "Oh my God, I wish I could have gone to an American like high school or party like it is in the movies." And it's like,
absolutely.
Coming from the States, it sounds very silly, but it's powerful, right? And so
we all, I mean, seriously, we all grew up with like Beverly Hills. I don't know what it's called in England, in America, 210. I mean, this is the things that you see on television. It's not necessarily German shows, but you aspire to be like American. So it's more than Hollywood. It's like it has a big draw. Completely right.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I've been in Europe for about 10 years now, but grew up in the States. And it's really interesting to hear people talk about, when they were kids, like, oh my God, I was so obsessed with this. And, it all seems kind of banal and ordinary to me. And I think that actually sort of contributes to, I think, the lack of appreciation of U.S. cultural power among Americans, because when you're in the kind of center of all of this, you don't realize you are. Same way, like Europeans knowing like, oh yeah, the 3rd congressional district of Pennsylvania is a really key battleground in the upcoming election. It's like people know all this stuff about the U.S. that's really, I think, dumbfounds a lot of Americans. And so I think they don't realize the degree of power they have. And so it makes it easier to tolerate the vandalism. Yeah. And so U.S., but this would all contribute to this idea of hegemony, right? Yes, the U.S. has the guns and the money, but it also has all this we're talking about.
Yeah. So the soft power.
The US, exactly.
Yeah.
And what Trump seems to be trying to take away is saying, we don't care about like making you like us anymore, right? Like we don't need to make you want what we want, to use the Joseph Nye formulation. We'll just do what we want using the economic power, you see sanctions, tariffs, et cetera, and also threats of military force, or even the use of military force. Obviously, there are strikes on Iran. It seems like we're still debating kind of interventions in Venezuela. And I think this is an important point to make, because sometimes people will say Trump's an isolationist, right? But he's not an isolationist. He's very willing to intervene or engage abroad. It's just that it has to be on the U.S. terms, and it's often with coercive economic or outright violent military force. And this whole concept of, we want to espouse American values and get people to want to come to the U.S. and like us, that's completely out the window. And so that's what we talk about, going from hegemony to just a strategy of dominance.
Okay, so that is interesting, because is this retreat from the soft power that we just talked about, is this intentional? So is this an intentional decision that Trump and his administration is taking? Or is it just a byproduct of, domestic political shifts and the shift that you were just talking about, going into military interventions, but just on our terms, not on maybe other people's terms?
Yeah, I don't think anyone in the administration would sort of see themselves as, we're like turning down, like they have a little control switch and they're turning the soft power dial down because they're like, no, we don't want that anymore. I don't think they would necessarily formulate it like that. I think they just think it's irrelevant, or it just like it doesn't matter. And I think that's a kind of privilege that only a very kind of culturally powerful country could have. Like they don't realize the amount of influence that they're able to project worldwide due to U.S. soft power.
Seriously?
So I find
that incredible, to believe that you don't see the impact that you have.
They think the U.S. is terribly disadvantaged and taken advantage of by people from abroad, right? And no, this kind of goes back to this point about, that like on an anecdotal level about hearing, people about people's childhoods and what they thought of the U.S. and Americans not being aware of that. But I think that kind of ignorance goes all the way up to the top. And so I don't think they realize exactly what they're losing and what they're throwing away. At the same time, back to my first point, is they're a little bit more insulated from the consequences of their actions because there is still this kind of private sector appeal of the U.S. So it's not like, if you had Marine Le Pen in France and they, there's so much funding for, say, like French cinema through that. If you made this all kind of, right-wing propaganda, et cetera, and you changed all the funding requirements in French cinema, you see an immediate effect, right? But in the U.S., there's a little bit more wiggle room. And so, yeah, like I said, that's the luxury the U.S. has. And so, but the policy approach from the U.S. currently, I think it's a little bit of ignorance. Like I said, I also think it's just a belief that, like, soft power is basically soft, right? Like, no, that's squishy. That's not important. Like, we're the real kind of serious manly men here. Like, we'll bomb you or we'll sanction you, but we're not going to try to persuade you of anything. That's for losers. That's for the kind of like old guard of the U.S. that's been betraying American workers, been betraying, America, et cetera, all this kind of Trump rhetoric about the U.S. being ripped off. And I think they think funding, you see some of the Doge like posts that people will make and be like, oh my God, we spent $16 million on like whatever theater productions in Brazil or something. And it's like, I mean, that's no money for the US, right? Like, you got 500 people to like America more for that much. I mean, that's,
yeah.
But it sounds silly to a domestic audience.
Yeah.
And I think they don't realize the power of it.
Yeah, or the USAID. I mean, I think it was even Marco Rubio who said that, like, look, it's just, I mean, a year before he changed his mind, but it's just 1% of the whole domestic product, of the budget of the US that they're spending. And it has such an incredible impact on people's lives all around the world. And it really has no impact on the budget of the US. And still, they're cutting 83%. It's kind of crazy to think, that they're doing that. But
yeah, I think some of it's for a domestic audience, but I think some of it is also just to show, like, we're not, to kind of prove to the rest of the world that, we're not in this type of game anymore like using more persuasive means. Yeah. But it's like you said, the actual amounts of money are not very substantial, which makes the kind of focus on foreign aid sometimes a bit perplexing, right? Because it's like, if you can target your programs pretty well, like it's really not an expensive way to improve your image abroad.
But it's interesting that we're not in the game anymore. So who's now in the game? I mean, have other powers like China, like India, or middle powers like Turkey responded to this vacuum that the US has created?
So I think it's worth maybe backing up a little bit, because it's not like, all of a sudden the US steps back and the rest of the world then says, oh my God, there's this, this thing called soft power that we're missing out on, right? The term and the research on this there's kind of an interesting interlinkage between the actual kind of academic research and the policy focus. And so we include this in the paper, but there's this really like exponential rise in the amount of academic publications on soft power. At the same time, there's a huge increase in the amount of countries who explicitly pursue a strategy to increase their soft power. And so, like, Joseph Nye coins this term in 1990, and it's really the 21st century when that picks up, both academically and in a policy sense. And so, you see this kind of interlinkage between the two. And especially in the 2010s, you see the amount of countries that really have explicit soft power strategies increase dramatically, right? Not just, your kind of classic cultural powers like, say, the US, France, Germany, UK. Of course, then the Soviet Union had a big role to play during the Cold War. That kind of fell off after the fall of the Soviet Union. But then you see Russia kind of re-engage. And you also see countries like Turkey. I think it was maybe 2014 that Erdogan says, we need to toil and exert blood, sweat, and tears, kind of like Churchillian rhetoric to acquire to acquire greater soft power. And then,
Mm-hmm.
see the rise of institutions like the UNESCO Institute or TRT World, which are kind of roughly analogous to the Goethe Institute or Deutsche Welle. They have their own version of this as a middle power. China expands really rapidly with their Confucius Institutes, China Global Television. And so there are a number of countries that are kind of already trying to establish a greater presence in this space. And like I said, some of it's actually driven, it's a rare case, I think, actually, of academia influencing policy a lot. You have Chinese policymakers apparently calling up Joseph Nye and being like, hey, how can we increase our soft power? Which is, I think his response was, well, don't seem like you're trying so hard because the best propaganda doesn't look like propaganda. And so, the point being, the race was kind of on before this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And European countries have had very strong soft power and cultural industries. Germany traditionally hasn't liked to use the term soft power because for historical reasons, being sort of anxious about the concept of power. And there's been, some greater moves to try to pool that at the European level through a greater external cultural policy on the EU level. And China, as I said, had been spending, really, really massive amounts of money expanding their network. There had already been a backlash to these Confucius Institutes, though most in the U.S. have been closed. In a lot of Central and Eastern and Northern Europe, they've been closed as well, and been kind of reallocated to the Global South as part of their development strategy. So this was all going before 2025, right? It's not, like I said, it's not like Trump makes these cuts and then everyone says, do something. There was already a lot of competition. And I think the key issue with Trump and the cuts here, as we kind of use the term like filling the vacuum, because that's a lot of what's out there in terms of the journalistic coverage of this. But it's not a kind of simple like one-to-one, somewhat like there's X amount of cultural space and the US has, stepped back from 45% of it. And then that like exact amount of space is going to get filled by someone else, right? There's not a kind of finite amount of culture in the world or influence in the world. That being said, there is a lot of fear, especially even the kind of, say, like the old guard of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. They'll often say these things like, "Oh, this is a gift to Xi. This is a gift to Putin." They're going to step in and fill the vacuum left by the U.S. Right? And I think there's some truth to that. People, especially more in the Chinese case, I don't think Russia has a ton of kind of cultural sort of narrative appeal beyond its borders. Maybe it used to a little bit in the 2010s, but 2022 really changed that. And China, they're definitely making some moves, like I said, especially along their Belt and Road Initiative, the areas where they're working a lot on international development. However, there's not really any one single power that is trying to take up this complete kind of leadership role of the U.S. And I think that has to do a little bit with the actual ideologies that are espoused. Like I said, you can kind of critique how well America's lived up to its values over time, but it does have this very totalizing, very universalist ideology, right? Like I said, the shining city on a hill, et cetera. This idea that, the end of history concept that everybody's going to move to a kind of liberal democratic capitalism, human rights. Everyone's going to kind of move there over time. And so there's this way that like the U.S. can sell an image of kind of directionality or like a teleology of world history that has a kind of appeal where China doesn't really have that, at least not anymore. I mean, you could, Marxism in its own way has a kind of like teleology to it that like this is the world is all going to end up, when workers of the world unite and we have dictatorship of the proletariat, et cetera. But like, so there's a kind of directionality to that, but that's, that's gone. The Soviet Union's gone. China's state capitalist. So what China's selling now isn't this kind of world historical vision. It's a pretty pragmatic one. And so, yes, they might step in and actually kind of, surpass the U.S. in terms of cultural appeal and influence in some specific countries where they're working in terms of development. But there's not really a kind of vision that they're going to use to like replace what the U.S. has traditionally been selling. And so I think that's very important to remember. Like I said, it's not like, the U.S. takes one step back and China just steps into that space because they're completely different systems, because they have completely different ideologies. And I think, a lot of opponents of Trump's foreign policy, would count myself among them, but I think there's others who kind of try to, the way they think they can get support for their policies and opposition to Trump's is always kind of invoking this like China scare. And we make the point in the paper that, yes, this is probably good for China's global influence, but it doesn't mean that yeah, like it's not as simple as the US leaving the stage and China becoming the star of the show.
You said, I think, a very important thing. You said vision, to have a vision. So in your study, you identify 4 trade-offs that Europe and Germany must confront as they consider stepping into the soft power vacuum. Let's call it vacuum here. Can you briefly walk us through these trade-offs and so like how Europe and Germany could maybe fill in if they have a vision?
Absolutely. And I think, like we said, we kind of run through like potential challengers, right? Or like who could play a greater role. And, for the various reasons I laid out, we don't think China's actually as kind of strong a contender as is often said, relatively agnostic about regime type. But as you point out, as you allude to here, the other kind of obvious contender for a country or region that does kind of espouse very universalist values is Europe, the European Union. And we kind of focus specifically on Germany just due to the location of the project and our previous research. And we identify, though, as you said, like 4 kind of trade-offs as Europe wants to step maybe more into this role and maybe, pick up some of the slack left by the US or just generally kind of use this moment to assert itself and in some ways step out of the US's shadow. And we try to make it really clear that there are a number of key decisions that Europe needs to face, that it's been able to kind of just sort of rest on its laurels or stay relatively complacent over time. And the first of those trade-offs that we discuss is, we call it between Atlanticism and advancing universalist liberal democratic principles. Europe used to be able to be a close U.S. ally and say, we're in NATO, we support Atlanticism, we support the United States, and we believe in universal human rights and these kind of democratic principles. It's pretty hard to do that when the kind of rhetoric and actions coming from the White House are what they are. And so you can see this tension in Europe. Do we stay close to our U.S. ally for security and trade reasons, or do we kind of move out on our own a little bit more and actually stick up for the values we purportedly support? And so, we say that's kind of a trade-off, and that decision is going to become a lot clearer. The second one is between trying to sort of be a repairman or repair person for the liberal international order as it's kind of falling apart and kind of filling gaps left from U.S. withdrawal versus trying to create a new or kind of more revised and modernized system. I mean, a specific example of this might be that Europe has chosen to step in and fund some of Radio Free Europe as the U.S. funding for that has dried up. And, maybe that's the right thing to do in the short run. But we don't think necessarily like that Europe should just, kind of be the cleanup crew for the wreckage left by the U.S. Rather, use the funding, use the resources, use its narratives in order to help establish its own type of vision. The third is about the independence of external cultural policy institutions. External cultural policy, I've used the term a few times, but that's basically the policies that a government might enact in order to increase its soft power. And the institutions there, in the German context, those would be things like I've mentioned a few times, Goethe or IFA or Deutsche Welle, et cetera. And, Germany and a lot of other Western European countries enjoy a pretty strong degree of independence. They are funded often by the Foreign Office or Foreign Ministry, but operationally, right, there's a great degree of autonomy. What you're seeing now as defense budgets kind of go up and policymakers get more concerned about security threats, and also there's just kind of general budget strains. You see some indications that, this is across a number of countries, you see some indications that policymakers kind of want to reduce that independence because, this is not something we necessarily support, but you can see it from their perspective. If you're the foreign minister and you say, well, we're giving, X millions or billions of dollars to these institutions, and they're maybe espousing narratives or funding projects that like I don't personally support, right? And that's basically what you have in the US in the extreme. But, it's because it's very hard to quantify, right? You can, you can say, oh, we gave this much money and we have this many tanks now, right? But if you say, oh, we funded this many language classes and cultural exchange events, right?
Nobody sees it.
There's an element of softness to analyzing soft power too, right? And I don't. That's not something we really try to run away from. I mean, we in our reports we've done also with IFA and the External Cultural Policy Monitor, which has a few dozen country reports. We try to find a lot of quantitative data, but it's like kind of input data, right? Where we don't really claim to say exactly what it does. And from the governmental perspective, they want a return on investment. I can see how it's sort of frustrating to say, no, it's important. This is a good thing to do. We can't tell you exactly how.
Yeah.
But as you were saying with the US, you just have this sort of good vibes around it, right? And it's like you want to create that, and it is very important. And there are, if you want to be instrumental about it, there are payoffs down the line when that comes to security, trade, etc. But in the short term, it's very hard to quantify, and that's
you can maybe see it with people who come.
That's a feature, not a bug in our sort of analysis. But from a kind of bean counter perspective, that is.
So that was the third, or was the fourth?
Oh yeah, that was the third, and so that was just sort of my way of saying one of the reasons for the pressure on the sort of lack of independence, because they might say, well, what are we really getting for this? Okay, no, we're going to need Deutsche Welle. It's just an example. They're not actually doing this. But, say the German foreign minister is like, this is ridiculous. They can't be publishing news broadcasts that are counter to what I believe about international affairs. We need to have direct supervision of the ministry over the foreign broadcaster, right? That's the kind of pressure we're talking about. Hypothetically, in the German case, not hypothetically at all in the US case.
Yeah.
Where the first kind of threats were, we're going to directly monitor your content. And then it was, never mind, we're just going to get rid of it. And then you have the fourth.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I just wanted to ask, so what's the fourth trade-off or the fourth scenario?
Yeah. And the fourth would be between sort of Europe's strategy about soft power. And that would be just pursuing a kind of narrative agenda and trying to kind of get their voice out there more, versus also seeing soft power and these kind of three types of power as not entirely disconnected, but rather that understanding that a country's material well-being and actually contributes to its soft power, right? Europe used to have a great luxury of being both rich and free, right? So they could say, if you live by our type of values, look, we're rich. So there wasn't really any contradiction between the sort of material reality and the message. As kind of, economic stagnation has set in, and there's, other challenges in Europe, I think some of those promises ring a little more hollow. And from a soft power perspective, it's kind of tempting to almost double down, I guess, on messaging or you could critically call it propaganda if it gets too out of line with reality, of saying, no, Europe's the best. This is everything's great. And we identify a trade-off there between, well, do you want to just focus on the message or actually focus on the material substance of what's going on, whether that's, prosperity, whether that's personal freedoms, treatment of immigrants, etc. So we also identify that, soft power kind of, it helps these other types of power, but it also needs them, right? There's a persuasive power of prosperity, right? Of actual freedoms, right? And so we say that, Europe can't just sort of narrowly try to tailor its messaging without actually addressing some of these deeper structural problems.
Yeah. So if I understood it correctly, you recommend that Europe should recalibrate its power triangle and seek to strike a roughly equal balance between military and economic power and the soft power, while pursuing greater autonomy from the US. That's how I understood it from the study. And you call that scenario the super Switzerland, which I like that. I like that term. Can you explain what you mean by that? So you calibrate a little bit between, I think, scenario 3 and 4, I assume, what you just outlined.
Yeah,
correct.
Yeah, I would definitely encourage people to read the report. I realized it's difficult to describe a chart on a podcast.
Yeah.
Page 42 for those who have the PDFs in front of them. But yeah, the idea basically is we kind of outlined 4 different scenarios which hinge on how independent of the US Europe is and its relative focus on hard versus soft power. And what we then advocate is that I give them all different S names. It's a sidekick or a Sparta spokesperson or stargazer. And for catchiness sake, we say the ideal is actually a super Switzerland. And like I said, encourage everyone to read that report. Mm-hmm. But the idea there is that the EU should not while we say it shouldn't kind of just remain like the sidekick of the US, right? It doesn't need to overly antagonize the US either. It should have a kind of degree of independence, and it shouldn't just double down on purely military power either. That's the kind of the Sparta approach, right? Rather, there should be a roughly equal balance, as you say, and a kind of healthy degree of independence. For the sake of readability, we call that super Switzerland. The idea not being like it should emulate every Swiss policy, right? Mm-hmm. But that the Swiss have a very strong economy, strong cultural pull, but also a strong military for a country of the size. Like they can kind of, they can handle themselves on the world stage, and they're, able to strike alliances or agreements with countries on a kind of on a basis that suits their interests, and without kind of, like I said, overly going down the naive role of having basically no functioning military, but also not abandoning your whole kind of welfare state and cultural appeal just for the sake of militarization. And so we kind of see, Europe as the kind of adopting Super Switzerland, the sort of like idea of a continent that can defend itself, that still prizes culture, and that is not kind of overly dependent on any foreign power, whether that's Russia, China, or...
So the restraints and the tensions that you just explained, what do they tell us about the international environment that Europe is operating in today? And do you think that considering these tensions, Europe and Germany could really realistically fill this gap that the US has produced?
Yeah. As a lot of people have remarked on, I mean, there's obviously rising international tensions. You see this phrase thrown around a lot. Geopolitics is back, et cetera. And, we wouldn't disagree with any of that. Of course, the world has become a lot more crisis-ridden in the last decade or two. The benefit of that, in a way, is that like crisis kind of reveals contradictions, or it brings things out that maybe had been able to fly under the radar for a while. And those are those four trade-offs I specified earlier. Is, these kind of contradictions or tensions have always been there, right? You maybe saw this, like that first one about Atlanticism versus universalist principles, and a flare-up, say, like during the Iraq War. Oh, that kind of dies down. Obama gets elected. People forget about that, right? And, but the severity of this crisis now has kind of forced a lot of these tensions and contradictions into really sharp relief. And so obviously it's difficult. Crisis management is hard. At the same time, there is a kind of benefit of actually being able to see the world more clearly now. And, ideally that kind of forcing an honest reckoning with the various policy choices that are facing Europe. And it's not, filling a gap, right? It's maybe not the best way to put it. I know we use that language ourselves, but we actually kind of, we kind of push back on it in the report and show why it's more complicated than that. But there is definitely an opportunity for Europe to step in here. And, that's as both, like I said, on the narrative level, right? With the kind of, there's no longer this superpower espousing these, in many cases, still quite appealing notions of democracy and human rights, et cetera. And so, Europe is able to actually get that message out there. But as I specified earlier, it has to live up to that at home as well, because people are, very able to see contradictions, especially now where you can, get immediate video from any country. If there's some sort of abuses going on in that country, it's very, it's just much more easy to point out hypocrisy than it used to be. So Europe needs to get that message out there, but also live up to it at home. And in a way, what we describe in the report is that, in a way, Europe needs to actually move in the direction China has in terms of strategy, right? Not in terms of human rights at home, but that's China used to think we can just get our message out there and everyone will like us, right? And that didn't really work, right? A lot of that failed.
Yeah.
And so when we say Europe should be more like China in terms of its approach, like I said, not necessarily in terms of the content of governance, but rather their kind of new understanding that, wait, like economic power is an element of soft power, right? It's not just something that we want soft power in order to increase trade deals to boost our economy, or we have more money so we can invest it in soft power, but rather your economic prosperity and your material conditions of a given country are actually an element in increasing its appeal abroad. And China has really strongly done that, saying, like, we don't care what type of government you have, like we're development, we're infrastructure, right? And that has a soft power to it. And so if Europe can sort of take that approach of wielding the material realities in the country to a kind of narrative, that's what we mean about adopting more that approach.
So more of a pragmatic approach, probably, to take that. Looking at the time, I think I have to ask you my final question, although this is so interesting. I'd love to listen to you more, but everybody can read the report and I'll tell you guys where to find it later. But let me ask you my last question. What could a coherent European message be? Like, after all that you laid out and pointed out, and how can cultural institutions like the IFA and the Goethe Institute or the British Council and the Institut Français in France contribute to this? Because you've also mentioned them a lot before.
Yeah, absolutely. We really identify the core strengths of Europe. I mean, there's one of those would be obviously the kind of internal diversity within the country. Obviously, there's a lot of different European countries, different languages, and that's a kind of clear appeal of Europe abroad. It also, I think, needs to work on a little bit more about being kind of tolerant of diversity from other regions, which, is, of course, kind of hot button political issue in a number of countries. But I think when there's kind of sort of seeming a lack of tolerance, right, that's something that gets perceived, abroad. And so essentially, right, yeah, it's the tolerance and acceptance of diversity, the idea that, freedom and prosperity can go together. And then that's the reality at home. And then kind of leveraging that abroad to say, look, like the things we're doing here, they work, right? This isn't just words. And so, yeah, it goes back to that point I made a few times about linking the actual on the ground reality to that messaging. And in a way, a lot of it's the message that's worked before for Europe, right? A lot of these countries have been democracies for a long time. And so in some ways, it's kind of going back to what's worked in the past. Of course, you need some kind of changes in that respect, whether that's coming to terms with colonial legacies or, other forms of exclusion. But overall, yeah, like leveraging the different viewpoints within the continent as a strength rather than a weakness, right? We often hear that Europe needs to speak with one voice, in the kind of international policy sense. And, maybe there's an element of truth to that for kind of one unified message, like I said. However, the diversity of viewpoints, I think is really important, whether that's the kind of newer EU countries or, Northern versus Southern Europe, et cetera. That's something that should be kind of really clear to outsiders, that there's not this kind of, kind of like hegemonic or monolithic European way of doing things. Rather, there's this sort of internal tolerance for diversity. We find that really important, in addition to, jumpstarting the economy as a kind of key way of showing, like, no, these ideals actually work, right? Authoritarianism doesn't produce greater wealth than democracy, and so on. And the institutions, to your last point, there's already a good deal of coordination between those, whether that's through UNIC or other means. And I think, there should be kind of coordination on this, like this broader picture, right, of like viewing themselves as part of foreign policy in a sense, right? We very much support the independence of these institutions. I think just kind of an honest assessment, though, right? If you're funded by a foreign ministry, right, you're probably somehow involved in foreign policy. And I think sort of admitting and acknowledging that while preserving independence is important, and kind of coordinating on this kind of core message that I laid out. But then, also doing a lot of the great work they already do, right? We're not trying to tell the IFA or Goethe, how to change their day-to-day operations at all. Like, there is a lot of great work that's out there. Sometimes it's maybe kind of boosting digital presence to get that, to increase awareness of that, or kind of coordinating better with other institutions, both within the country, and in other countries, about the kind of most effective way to pursue this goal, which, like we said, you want to see some kind of direction, some kind of strategy, some kind of unified approach, but by no means should all these institutions be marching in lockstep. That's totally counter to what we identify as Europe's main.
Yeah. And maybe one last thing, because as you said earlier, like, it's important to bring about the point of freedom and prosperity and to be in one, to speak with one voice and to kind of point out the ideals that Europe has. But I think with this, as you said, like admitting things and also be clear about the past, I guess, especially in the global south, it's quite important to see the double standards. Europe has a legacy or a history of colonialism, and especially in the global south. So I guess it's very important to address also these things and be open about this and transparent, and in order to then get the point across that things have changed, and like to really speak with one voice about, freedom and prosperity, and have this clear appeal also in the global south, correct?
Absolutely. And to not have, this sort of this easy to point out hypocrisy, right? Like I think that's a very important thing. And there's obviously been a lot of debates in Germany recently about how it's sort of processed, the legacy of the Holocaust and so on. And, if that's perhaps like lopsided and how it's implemented in some ways. But, typically I think like that's been a great strength of Germany. It's something people like say abroad. They say, oh, Germany's come to terms with its past. That's really great. And I think you see kind of more reticence about doing that with colonial history. But what I think, Germany does show is that, it almost sounds, you don't want to sound overly instrumental about it, but like it can actually be a kind of good like nation branding opportunity to be like, no, we're the country that sort of come to terms with this. We're sending back the artifacts from the British Museum or whatever it is. Like I think that kind of thing actually has a lot of persuasive power, rather than, oh no, we need to hide this, we need to not discuss this. I think that like openness actually is something that really does appeal to a lot of people. Definitely encourage European countries to not be so kind of shy about some of the darker moments in their past, and then kind of seeing that maybe as an opportunity to actually increase appeal by addressing them rather than.
Absolutely. Honesty and openness goes a long way. So great. Thank you so much, Edward, for your time, for your insights. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish we had more time in this podcast. Thank you for being with us. Thank you so much.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of this episode. If you would like to read the report by Edward Knudsen, please take a look at the show notes for this episode. There you will find a link to Domination Without Hegemony, the emerging contest to fill the US soft power vacuum. And it's really worth a read. Please take a look at the show notes. And a few episodes ago, I spoke with Professor Carlo Marsala about the European security policy and soft power. So if you would like to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend listening to that episode as well. You can find this and over 80 other episodes on foreign cultural policy wherever you listen to your podcast, on Spotify, Apple Music, or Deezer. You can also find out more about IFA and our projects on our social media channels. On Instagram, you will find the profile with the handle @ifa.de and on LinkedIn as IFA Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen. If you have any questions or comments about the cultural mediators, please send us an email to podcast@ifa.de. With that, I say goodbye. My name is Amira El Al. Thank you so much for listening, and bye-bye.